We are honored tonight to have Katharine Hayhoe speak with us. And I just would like to for those of you who don't know her history, give you a little introduction. Katharine is an accomplished climate scientist with over 120 peer-reviewed publications in the top journals in the field. She's also a remarkable communicator. Recognized by Time magazine as one of the top 100 most influential people in the world, not in the country, but in the world, by Foreign Policy as one of the top 100 global thinkers, and by Fortune magazine as one of the 50 world's greatest leaders. She has served on panels for the National Academy of Science, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and many other professional organizations devoted to understanding and communicating climate change. As a world-class climate scientist and a Christian, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe may defy some stereotypes about the politics of religion and science, but by defying stereotypes invites inquiry, which can lead to communication, even learning. It creates opportunity for thinking deeply about and aligning what we value and what we do. Climate change is a huge issue, and it's one where citizen engagement is critical. That's why her work is so fascinating, in part because it's about climate change, and also because her main theme, faith and science, defies stereotypes. So now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Katharine Hayhoe and welcome her to this presentation.
Thank you. It's great to join you here today. Let me just share my screen here. So I'm going to talk about climate change from maybe a little bit of a different angle. I am a climate scientist. This is what I do. I specifically look at how the different choices that we might make over coming decades will affect our future. But what I've learned through talking to thousands of people around the United States and really around the world is that more facts and figures about heat flux and cloud types, that's not what's going to change people's minds. Because when we think about climate change, we have to think about something that actually matters to us. Otherwise, why bother? There's so many things today to be worried about. It's hard to prioritize. And often climate change seems like the last thing on our list. Because when you poll people and you say, what's the #1 symbol or picture that you would associate with the changing climate? Just think for yourself here in your head, what picture, if somebody said global warming or climate change to you, what picture would you pull up in your head? For most people, the picture that they would pull up in their head is this. A polar bear usually standing on a piece of ice that's melting. But the reality is that most people have never seen a polar bear in the wild. So if the #1 symbol of this issue is an animal that they have never seen before with their own eyes in the wild, then why should they care about it? If we put a human face on climate change, until recently that human face has typically been people who live very far away, people who live on low-lying islands in the South Pacific that are being flooded as sea level rises. But usually not people who live in our communities, who we might know, who are being affected by a changing climate. That's why I'm firmly convinced that one of the most dangerous myths that the largest number of people have bought into is not the myth that the science isn't real. Now you might say, hang on, but Katharine, don't you? Yes, I do every day. I know exactly what people are saying about the science of climate change. But I also know that those number of people, even though they're very loud, are actually a much smaller group than the number of us who've bought into this myth, the myth that climate change is a distant issue. It only really affects either future generations or people who live very far away from me. Now, because I'm a scientist, I want to show you this using the data. I'm going to start with this map, and this is a wonderful map from the Yale Climate Opinion Maps. You can find it yourself if you just Google Yale Climate Opinion. And they have these maps for Canada as well, although they didn't ask quite as many questions for Canada. And they've even done a bit of work in Europe too. So these maps are for the US, and they show public opinion by county here. Each little box there is a county. They ask people, do you think global warming is harming animals? And anything that is orange is above 50%, and the darker orange it is, the more people say yes. Well, it turns out pretty much everybody in the US would agree that global warming is harming animals. Okay, polar bear, check. Then they said, do you think global warming will harm future generations? Everybody says yes. So they think it's going to harm the polar bear, and they think it's going to harm people who live in the future. But then they said, do you think global warming will harm people in developing countries? And, you know, most people still said yes. And then they said, do you think it will harm people who live in the United States? See the difference there? Let me just take you back. Developing countries, future generations, in the United States now or in the next 10 years. All of a sudden, the map is blue. What does that mean? It means that people might agree it's going to affect plants and animals and people in developing countries and future generations, but they don't think it's going to affect us in the places where we live. And it doesn't stop here. They asked one more question. They said, do you think it is going to affect, how can we get closer to home? You. And this was the answer. Now, if you're wondering who lives in those few orange counties that I can see, there's some orange counties in northern New Mexico and southern Texas. Who lives in those counties? The most concerned people group about a changing climate in the entire US lives in those counties. You know who the most concerned people are about a changing climate in the US? Hispanic Catholics. Now you might say, oh, well, that's because of the Pope, right? You know who's the least concerned people group in the US? White Catholics. And that shows us that this is not a religious issue. It is not a scientific issue. It is an issue of political polarization, saying that it does not matter to us. This is a more recent summary that goes all the way up to 2018. It was conducted by Gallup, and they've been doing this since 2000, so almost 20 years. This is a summary of what people think. Turns out that most people agree that scientists believe global warming is occurring, and we do. Most people actually agree global warming is caused by human activities, 64%. 60% believe the effects have already begun, which they have. But then look at the last two questions. Do you think global warming will pose a serious threat in your lifetime? 45%. Do you worry about it? 43%. That's where the issue is. The issue is not up above, the issue is down below. So again, one of the most dangerous myths I'm convinced that we've bought into is that it is a distant issue. It only matters to people who live far away or future generations. And even more, if it ever becomes a problem, somebody else will take care of it for me. Now, this myth is starting to shatter. Because when we read the news and we read that, you know, regulations on coal are being rolled back, tariffs are being slapped on solar panels, the US is going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, it's starting to dawn on most of the people in the middle, which is actually where most people are, that no, nobody is going to fix this for us. We have to do it ourselves. And that takes me to my darkest blue map. You thought the previous one was bad? This is the darkest blue one. This is where they ask people, do you ever talk about it? And they don't. Look at this. Hardly anybody ever talks about it. What can we say when we talk about it? This is kind of how I feel as a climate scientist when I find out that nobody talks about this issue that affects everybody at this time in this country. Why does it matter? I think we have to start with this question. Why does climate change even matter? Because for many of us, we say, oh, well, of course it matters. But why? We have to be able to articulate why it matters to people. You can't just tell someone, you should care, you ought to care, you better care. We have to be able to understand fundamentally ourselves why it matters, and then we have to be able to share that with others. So why does climate change matter? We get floods naturally. And I'm going to show you a few pictures all from Texas all the last couple of years. We get floods naturally. We get hurricanes naturally. We get droughts naturally. We get record-breaking fires naturally. This is just part of life on this planet. And this is what our brains are built to remember. Our brains are built to remember the ups and the downs, the record cold and heat, the record wet and dry. That's what our brains are built to remember. But what we don't often think about is the fact that our entire civilization is not built on remembering the coldest day of the year or the wettest day of the year. Our civilization, and by that I mean our energy resources, our water resources, our agriculture, our building codes, our infrastructure, our economy, our national security, it's built on the assumption that we can have highs and lows and ups and downs and crazy weather and normal weather, but it all averages out in the end. Such that what happened over the last 30, 50, 100 years is a perfect predictor of what's going to happen in the future, and we can plan accordingly. What type of planning is built on this assumption of a stable climate? What type of houses we build, where and how much energy they need, what type of crops we grow and when and where. How do we draw our flood zones based on past climate? How do we plan for the future of our water, looking at how much water we've had in the past? This is built into the fabric of our society because we've had a remarkably stable climate over the course of human civilization. Yet today, climate is changing faster than any time that we've seen in human civilization. And that is why it matters. Was it warmer back in dinosaur times? Yes. But did we have 2/3 of the world's biggest cities within a few feet of sea level? No. We care about a changing climate because there's 7.5 billion people on the planet. And we have built that civilization that supports us with our food, our water, our resources, our infrastructure on the assumption that climate is stable. Not only that, but we've created safety nets. We've created insurance. We have government assistance during disaster. We even have National Guard or the Army to help out when there's disasters. But increasingly, these safety nets are getting overwhelmed. Farmers Insurance sued the city of Chicago a couple of years because it couldn't keep up with the flood damages because they had accelerated so much because of a changing climate. And they said the city had to do something about it. FEMA, under President Obama, started to require every single state to account for how the risks were changing due to climate change. And they had to do this in order to get FEMA disaster relief. Because otherwise you could just be saying, oh, I'm just going to go with the old flood zones that we had. Well, you know what? Houston had 500-year flood events before Harvey in 3 years. The old flood definitions don't work. And if we're using them, we're going to end up having emergencies a lot more frequently than we used to. The way I think of it is kind of like driving down a road in Texas. This is where I live in Lubbock, Texas. And the roads are so straight here because it's so flat that you could drive a ways up this highway here that you can see with the orange arrow. You could be driving a ways up this highway, staying not just on the road, but in the same lane, looking in the rearview mirror. Why? Because the road is so straight that where you were 5 seconds ago, 15 seconds ago, a minute ago, is a perfect predictor of where you'll be in the future. But just before you get to Plainview, Texas, which is just off the top of the map, just before Plainview, there's a giant curve in the road. And if you're driving north, looking in the rearview mirror and you get to that curve, I think we all know what's going to happen. In the same way, planning for the future based on the past is like driving down the road looking in the rearview mirror. It works great if climate is stable and the road is straight. But if there's a curve in the road, we have to look ahead and prepare for a changing climate. Otherwise, we will run off the road. And today, we are already on that curve and our wheels are already on the rumble strip. So here's our assumption of a changing climate. We still get our variability. We still get our ups and downs, heat and cold, wet and dry, extremes in both directions. But the frequency and the risk of many of those is changing. We care about a changing climate because our society and our civilization is built on the assumption of a stable climate. And as climate changes, it is making all of our infrastructure and our water planning and our agriculture unsuited to the plans we've made, but it's also exacerbating many of the risks that we face. One of the first ways that we are already seeing climate change affect us today is through taking the weather and climate disasters that occur naturally already and amping them up or exacerbating them. This is a map created, I don't have a similar map for other countries. I'm trying to get the data to make one for Canada. This is a map for the US though, showing the number of disasters that have cost at least $1 billion worth of damage since 1980. Now, why is Texas number one? It's number one because naturally speaking, we get everything. We get hurricanes and droughts and dust storms and haboobs. We get winter storms, believe it or not, we do, and hail and blizzards and windstorms and heavy rain events. We get pretty much everything in Texas naturally. So why do we care about a changing climate? It's because it's increasing the risks, it's amplifying them. So let's take Hurricane Harvey for an example. Would Hurricane Harvey have occurred 100 years ago without, before climate had changed very much? The hurricane itself, yes. The hurricane itself probably would have occurred 100 years ago. But would it have been so strong? No. Would it have moved so slowly? No. Would it have been so big? No. Would it have broken so many rainfall records? Absolutely not. In fact, we now know that about 40% of the rain that fell during Hurricane Harvey, 40% was the result of a warming planet. In other words, if you had a Hurricane Harvey 100 years ago, it would have only had 60% of the rain. And in some places they got 50 inches. Imagine the difference between 30 inches of rain, which is still quite bad, and 50 inches of rain, which is devastating. That's why we care about a changing climate. It's not creating new risks we've never seen before. It's taking the risks that we're familiar with and it's amplifying them. It's putting them on steroids. It's making them stronger and stronger and increasing the risks and the damages associated with them. When it happens in a place like Houston, the National Guard rolls out, the insurance companies kick in, the repairs get started immediately as soon as the storm goes. But when it hits a place like Puerto Rico, 3 months after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, half the island did not even have electricity. It ripped through some Caribbean islands and left them entirely devastated. Dominica was uninhabited for a while. So this raises an even more important issue. The more vulnerable we already are today, the more vulnerable we are to a changing climate. Those who already have the least today are those who have the most to lose in the future. And that's not really fair. This is what I mentioned before. This is the farmers insurance suing the city of Chicago for failing to prepare for a changing climate. And then of course, it seems like the headlines every day are talking about last year was the warmest year on record. This fire was the largest wildfire ever. I should note that the Thomas wildfire is not the largest fire. That record has been broken 2 times since that headline came out 8 months ago. Things are changing very quickly to the point where the Prime Minister of Dominica, when he was speaking to the United Nations after the hurricane season last year, he said, to deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have lived. Climate change is no longer a future issue. Today, we have finally gotten to the point where no matter where we live, we can point to something that is happening that affects us and the places where we live in a way that actually matters to us. And the #1 way we can do that is by showing how climate change is amplifying the risks of what used to be naturally occurring events, whether droughts, heavy rainfall events, heat waves like we saw this summer, or stronger hurricanes. As John Holdren, who was the former president's science advisor, said, how do we respond to this? We have 3 choices. We can reduce our emissions, that's mitigation. Our carbon emissions from burning coal and gas and oil is what's driving this problem. We can reduce our carbon emissions. We can prepare for a very different future, that's adaptation. Or, and this is not a very sciencey word, or we can suffer. We are going to do some of each. The question right now is simply what the mix is going to be. because the more mitigation we do, the less adaptation will be required and the less suffering there will be. So what do these three things look like? If these are our choices, and if we are going to do some of each, but we want to make sure we do as much mitigation as we can so the adaptation is successful to minimize the suffering, what do each of these three things look like? Let me give you some examples. These are just examples. I could give an entire, in fact, actually, I do give an entire course on this. Next semester, I teach a course that's primarily for students in public administration, and it talks all about what we can do to mitigate and to adapt to prevent suffering. So for 10 minutes now, you're going to get a summary of an entire semester's worth of material. And as you can see, this is where I get really excited, because when we see people doing something, that's what motivates us to do something too and to care. So when we talk about climate change, rather than talking about all the doom and gloom that we see in the science, which unfortunately we do, once I start talking about what we see happening here in adaptation and mitigation, that's where we can start to connect with people, and that's where the message starts to really resonate. So what does adaptation look like, for example, in Chicago? Why did I pick Chicago? It's because Chicago was one of the very first cities that I ever worked with. It's been 10 years now since we developed customized climate projections for the city of Chicago, and we used them to look at 110 different ways that temperature and precipitation could affect the city of Chicago. Everything from Great Lake levels to beaches flooding, to wastewater treatment plants overflowing, to what happens to the Chicago Transit Authority. Let me show you some of the things that we did and some of the ways that the city is responding. The first thing we did was to identify the risks. How do we identify the risks? We asked the people who already knew what those risks are. And they're not the climate scientists. They're the people who work in that area every day. Yesterday, I met with Texas corn producers. They're the ones who know the risks. And so I spent a lot of time asking them what types of situations they had dealt with. And I learned a lot about how disease overwhelmed a number of their crops last year because it was very warm, but also very rainy. And when it's warm and rainy, disease runs rampant. I didn't know that. With Chicago, there's all kinds of things I didn't know about Chicago, even though I actually went to graduate school in Illinois. Flooding is endemic. I didn't know that. I didn't know that they already have a problem where they have to shut down the metro train when it gets too hot because the rails warp. And then when we were talking about this, the city made representatives from 18 different departments sit down in this room together to talk to us about it. And you could tell some of the people were wondering why they were there. Like the Department of Emergency Response was like, surely we have more important things to be doing, like saving people's lives, than sitting here listening to this climate scientist. But after we started talking, and the CTA said, well, our rails warp when it gets over 94 degrees. Can you give us projections decade by decade by decade of how many days per year on average? Of course, some years are warmer, some are colder. But on average, can you tell us how many days per year we'll have over 94? Because then we'll know by when we should start replacing our rails ahead of time to minimize the amount of money we'll have to put into shutting down the rail and busing people. So we said, yeah, we can give you that information. We can't tell you the temperature on July 18, 2032, but we can absolutely tell you on average in the 2020s, 2030s, 2040s, how many days you'll have over 94. So then the emergency response people said, can you tell us the number of days per year over 96? And I said, yes, we could do 96 too. Why? They said, well, because we staff by the thermometer. The south side of Chicago, which is has hardly any trees, there's a lot of people in very poor condition there who cannot afford to pay their air conditioning. And when it gets really hot out, they're afraid to open their window. They said, when the temperatures soar, the emergency calls soar too. Health problems, people's tempers soar. There's all kinds of issues associated with that. We could do that. It turned out that out of the 18 departments that originally came into that small windowless conference room in downtown Chicago that one day, 14 of them identified at least one, some of them many, different ways that their operations or their maintenance were affected by a changing climate. From the natural gas and the air conditioning that the public school board used, to the types of trees they plant in their parks. They're now planting trees that are native to southern Illinois in Chicago parks, because when those trees reach maturity, they will be at the climate of Southern Illinois. And we got that information for them. The Chicago Metro, as I said, they currently even run cooling trains on the L where they spray water on the tracks to cool it down in summer. They have a plan now to replace those rails. We looked at pothole formation from freezing and thawing and freezing and thawing. If you've ever been to Chicago, you know potholes are a terrible problem there. And we looked at all kinds of things, even the fact that some of their summer festivals, which they're famous for, which bring in a lot of tourist revenue, might have to be moved to earlier in the year so they didn't occur when it was really incredibly hot and humid outside, because when that happens, attendance drops and they actually lose a lot of money. One of the biggest issues in Chicago is flooding, but flooding is not easy to deal with. So we developed the projections for them, but it wasn't until I was giving a presentation about 4 years later, and I thought to myself, well, what have they done about flooding? I don't know what they've done. I haven't heard anything. So I Googled it, and that same week I Googled it, there were these two news stories. New sewers quickly dispatch heavy rains, and massive new reservoir to help alleviate Chicago area flooding. It takes a couple of years to get these type of initiatives underway. It was 4 years after we actually developed the projections that they made this happen, but it's amazing that they can do this. And because they've done this, their city is more resilient and more prepared for a changing climate. And one of the most interesting things they did was we looked at heat waves. Back in the 1990s, there were 2 devastating heat waves that killed hundreds of people in Chicago. Chicago is very sensitive to the fact that the urban heat island effect magnifies the influence of a heat wave. So, you know, cities are much warmer than the surrounding rural area because all the dark surfaces trap heat. And then even at night, the buildings are giving off heat. And so what Chicago decided to do was they decided that they were going to take their own microclimate into their own hands, and they were going to lower the urban heat island effect of their city by the same amount that climate change was pushing it up. How? Green roofs, tree planting, more reflective surfaces, so that as climate changes, as it gets warmer due to changing climate, Chicago is actually lowering the temperature of its urban heat island effect, so it won't see that many changes in the city itself. Isn't that incredible what people can do to adapt? It absolutely blows your mind, but you have to know what's happening. You have to take your eyes off the rear view mirror, and you have to look ahead down the road to see what's happening in order to be able to prepare. So those are just a couple of adaptation examples that get me really excited. Right now I'm working with Austin in Texas. I worked with Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago. We're also looking at the province of Alberta in Canada. I'm helping all of these people look down the road and prepare for a changing climate. But we also need to consider mitigation, because our adaptation is only successful if we also mitigate. If we allow emissions to continue unchecked, there's no adaptation in the world that's going to help us reduce and eliminate the suffering associated with those changes. So what does mitigation look like? For mitigation, the example I picked here is Texas. Why? Because Texas has some of the highest greenhouse gas emissions per capita in the country. Texas, yes, is one of the worst emitters. So you might say, okay, well, but aren't you going to give us a, yes, I am. There are incredible things happening in Texas. Let me tell you. Texas has the biggest military base in the US. It's called Fort Hood. It's in Killeen, Texas. Last year, they were looking for a new contract to supply their electricity. They got all the bids in and they took the cheapest bid. The cheapest bid was not natural gas. It was wind and solar, and it saves taxpayers over $160 million in Texas. Every spring in Texas, there's new records being broken. We're currently, on average, after 2017 finished, we're up to about 20% power. And we even have entire towns in Texas going with clean energy. The reason why this town here, Georgetown, Texas, which is just north of Austin, the reason why they went with green energy was not because of a bunch of environmental groups. It was because 3 business students from the local college, for a project for their class, figured out how much the city could save if it got its own energy source, looked at the different costs of all the energy, realized that wind and solar is actually cheaper in Texas now than natural gas, it is, went to city council, showed them how much money they could save, and they made a very financially prudent decision, which, by the way, also happens to reduce their carbon emissions. Now, people always say, when you start talking about, what about mitigation, that one of the favorite things people say, and I hear this almost every week, is, yeah, but we could reduce our emissions to meet the Paris Agreement or even further, but it wouldn't even matter because China's building a new coal-fired power plant today. They used to be, but they're not anymore. They're shuttering coal plants in China now. They've turned off the last coal-fired power plant that supplies Beijing a couple of months ago. China now has more wind and solar energy than any other country in the entire world, and India is not far behind. So when we talk about mitigation, I love talking about what's happening in Texas and California, and how Rhode Island has the first offshore wind turbine farm in the country, and how Iowa is, I think they're like 37% wind or something like that too. But in addition to that, I like talking about what's happening in other places that you wouldn't expect. The fact that China is spending billions of dollars on clean energy. The fact that we have incredible technology. We have solar shingles, but we also have solar panels. And in sub-Saharan Africa, where about 700 million people do not have electricity today, pay-as-you-go solar is one of the ways that is electrifying those rural areas faster than anything else. Don't you love that picture? We can talk about what personal mitigation looks like, whether it's a plug-in car. I got a plug-in car last year, and for the first couple of weeks, we had it plugged in outside our house. Now, I live on a cul-de-sac in Texas, and all of our neighbors drive these giant Yukons. And when someone passes you as they're driving by, they wave out the window. They don't roll down the window's up because the air conditioning's on. They just wave. So we had this car plugged in outside the house. And every single neighbor stopped, got out of their car, walked over if we were standing there and said, "What is that?" We said, "Well, it's an electric car." And they said, "Does it have a gas pedal?" We said, "Yes." "Would you like to look at it?" "Yes, I would love to look at it." And then we talked about how much it costs to charge it and how far you can drive on it, and the fact that because we live in Texas, I got one that has a gas tank too, not a Tesla, so you can switch over if you need to. And where did you get that? And then for a couple times afterwards, whenever the car was parked outside, as they drove by, they would roll down the window and they'd lean out and they'd say, "I love your car." Those are the types of conversations we can have, even in Texas. And of course, we can talk about things like light bulbs. We can talk about all kinds of things. Mitigation today looks like everything from crazy new technology to super old stuff and everything in between. But the bottom line, though, is that our future really is in our hands. And this is the type of work I do. I look at the difference between a high carbon future and a low carbon future. And the difference is stark, and the difference is primarily due to the choices that we make in mitigation. It really is up to us. So lastly, what does suffering look like around the world? Well, we know what that looks like, but let me give you a couple of examples specifically related to a changing climate. This is a map that shows where those people live who are most vulnerable to a changing climate. And as we've already talked about, those people live in the places where they have the least. People who already suffer from hunger or poverty or disease or lack of access to clean water, they're the people who are most vulnerable to a changing climate, both here where we live, as well as in other countries around the world. Here where we live, the suffering associated with the changing climate looks like what we see happening on the Gulf Coast and the East Coast when climate change is supercharging our hurricanes, creating much more damaging impacts than they would have had 50 or 100 years ago. In the Arctic, it's thawing what used to be permanently frozen ground. There's over 200 Native American villages in Alaska alone, let alone the rest of the Arctic, that are at imminent risk. Who said that? The Army Corps of Engineers 10 years ago. Yet only one of those villages has managed to move. The monsoon is a natural part of life in Southeast Asia, but a warming ocean And all of the extra water that evaporates as the planet warms is supercharging the monsoon, to the point where last September, a year ago from now, over 1/3 of the entire country of Bangladesh was underwater. And this week, Kerala, India suffered from devastating floods. Is the monsoon normal and natural? Absolutely. Is this amount of rain associated with the monsoon normal and natural? No. Climate change is exacerbating these natural risks, making them worse and worse. That's what suffering looks like. Syria. We're all familiar with the Syrian refugee crisis. Was it caused by a changing climate? No, it wasn't. It was the result of all kinds of factors all coming together. Refugees kept pouring in from the Iraqi war over the last decade, a very corrupt political system, religious and civil tensions, all of that piled together, and then there was the icing on the cake. A record-breaking drought that was 2 to 3 times more likely as a result of a changing climate. That record-breaking drought did not cause the refugee crisis, but it was one more straw on top of the already overloaded camel's back that drove over 1 million farmers to abandon their land, move into the cities. Unemployment rates skyrocketed, contributing to civil tension and unrest, exacerbating the crisis to the point where it tipped it over the balance. That's what suffering looks like. The reason why I care about a changing climate is because it's kind of like this bucket. We already care about hunger and poverty and disease and people dying of waterborne illnesses, millions of them every year, most of them under the age of 5. We care passionately about these things, and we're pouring our money, our time, our hope, our prayers, our effort, everything we can into this bucket to try to fix the immense suffering that is already occurring today in the world. Yet there is a hole in that bucket, and that hole is climate change. The reason why I care about a changing climate is because there's the hole in the bucket of all the other things that I would like us to fix. That's what we have to be able to communicate to people. So when we talk about climate change, it isn't about the polar bear, although the polar bear is affected. It isn't only about people in low-lying islands in the South Pacific, although they are certainly affected. It's about people everywhere who are looking at increased risk of water shortages, impacts on their food and their security, looking at national security implications, looking at the economic impacts of a changing climate. All of these together are affecting us today, and that is why we care. So the bottom line is this. The bottom line is to care about a changing climate. It isn't just a matter of the science. It isn't just a matter of the traditional ways that we've thought about a changing climate, that it affects people far away or future generations or polar bears. The reality is that we care about a changing climate because it is affecting all of us today. And so what I'd like to do to close is I'd like to share the words of one of my favorite scientists with you. And she said this only a couple of years ago after a long career in science. It's Jane Goodall, and she said this: "It's only when our clever brain and our human heart work together in harmony that we can achieve our full potential." I think this holds true more than anything to a changing climate. It isn't just about our head and all the facts and data we know. It's about connecting all of that information to why we care about people. Thank you. Now, before I take any questions, which we absolutely are going to do since I think we have time, right? Let me just give you 2 resources before we take any questions. Resource number 1, if you want any more on the climate science, this is the most up-to-date report and summary of climate science in the world today, as far as I know. It just came out last November. I was one of the lead authors. You can find it at science2017.globalchange.gov, and there's nice summaries at the beginning of every chapter. I also did a webinar just a few weeks ago on this, this report. So if you'd rather listen to me talk again for another 45 minutes about climate science, this is what the webinar looks like. And if you just Google my name, Hayhoe, and climate science, what's new, you'll be able to find this on YouTube and watch it. And then lastly, if you're interested, I also have this little series called Global Weirding on YouTube. They are short videos, only 5 to 7 minutes long, about frequently asked questions that people have about climate change. Now, they're not actually cartoons. They're mostly me talking, but we do have some cartoons, and that's why we put a cartoon on the cover of each one. But they ask questions like, you know, my favorite, I'm only a kid, what can I do about climate change? Or how long have we known about this whole thing? Or if I just explain the facts, surely they'll change their mind, right? Or the Bible doesn't talk about climate change, does it? So if you're interested in more, check out our global weirding videos. All you have to do to find them is just Google global weirding and they'll pop right up on YouTube. Or you can look at our climate science report and the webinar that I did if you want more on the science. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful and tons of information. And we do have some questions, so I'm glad you're going to be able to have some time to stay with us a few more minutes. The first question is about China. One of our participants is asking, is China moving into building coal plants internationally? They've heard about them trying to build a plant in Uganda where the community resisted so much that they moved it to Latin America. Are you familiar with that?
So not that specific example, but I am familiar with, unfortunately, the terrible hypocrisy that China is shutting down its own coal-fired power plants because it knows the devastating toll that it has on people's health. And they're actually in China, they're flooding old open pit coal mines with water and they're putting floating solar panels on the top of them. And they are leading in wind and solar development. But the bottom line is they want to do whatever makes money. And unfortunately, in some places, rather than bring in the new technology that they have access to themselves in their own country, they are still trying to go with old technology in other places. Like, and it's basically, it's like trying to install, you know, phone wires when everybody already has cell phones. That's why I think technology transfer is so important, because some of the cheapest solar prices in the world today, they're not in the United States, I can tell you that. They're in Peru and Mexico and India. So things are changing very quickly, but unfortunately, when you have coal and you don't want to burn it, so you want to force somebody else to burn it, that's what's happening with China and with the US too.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. We have another question. How can we get our own cities and counties to plan for climate change, especially if we're in a poor rural area, and acknowledging that we're elders?
Yes. I feel as if elders have more weight often than the younger voices, because too often it's many of the young people who are advocating for change. And in my experience, as I am now kind of a mid-age person rather than younger, I have been patted on the head a lot. I have been told, oh, you're so cute and you're so sweet, but you don't know what you're talking about. When you're my age, you'll understand the world is a more complicated place. You don't have that problem. And because you don't, you can use it to say, I have lived here for this long, and draw on your experience. This is what I have seen in the place where we have lived. I have seen these types of things impact our people and our economy. I have seen these concerns that we have and these issues we need to address. But then most of all, come in with a solution. I have looked at it and I have talked to people, and here are some ideas that we could implement that would benefit us, and this is really important, for multiple reasons. Let me give you an example here in Texas. There's many small rural communities here in Texas that have lost their tax base and they've lost their young people. If you can't afford to pay for a decent doctor, decent teachers at the school, a playground for the kids, people don't want to stay there to raise their families, and if there's no jobs, even less. But today, wind technician is the fastest growing job in the entire United States. It has been for 4 years now. And they are putting in giant wind farms all over Texas. And so all of a sudden, there's this huge demand for younger people who have technical training to do maintenance on wind farms in all these small rural communities. And I've heard stories of some communities in our area where their tax base has increased by a factor of 10 after a wind farm came in. And all of a sudden, people's kids are coming back because you have the tax money you need now to upgrade the school, to pay for more teachers, to get the playground for the kids. And so you've grown the local community, you've built resilience, but you're also mitigating at the same time. There should always be multiple reasons for everything we propose. Doing something because of a changing climate that hurts us is never going to fly. We have to think of the reasons why it benefits us.
Thank you. We have another question. In light of Pope Francis, and how is it possible that white Catholics were the least concerned about climate change in the survey you referenced, and what's the origin of that survey?
Yes, the survey is from the American Association of Religion, and white evangelicals, I will say, are just a hair above white Catholics in terms of the people who care the least. But everybody reads the same Bible. And the Bible states very clearly in Genesis that humans are given responsibility or stewardship or dominion over this earth. And it states very clearly in Revelation that God will destroy those who destroy the earth. And there's many verses in between that talk about loving and caring, not just for nature or creation, but loving and caring for people, especially people who are poor and suffering. So it isn't our theology that is causing us to believe what we do. When you actually look at the social science of what makes people think what they do, the number one predictor of whether people think climate is changing and humans are responsible and we should do anything about it, the number one predictor is simply where we fall on the political spectrum. The more conservative we are, the less likely we are to agree with the science. Because we've been told that the person we are, who we are as a person, is not somebody who agrees with all of that liberal stuff.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have a couple more questions if you're still good and have a couple more minutes.
Mm-hmm.
This starts out with saying, thank you so much. This has been a very helpful introduction to ways we can address climate change, particularly at the local level. Do you have any suggestions for our members around the country about how to identify the mitigation and adaptation actions they can push for?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So there are a lot of resources for cities. There's a couple of different, there's the C4 cities, there's the, what's the other city organization? There's a lot of different city organizations, and they're not all big cities. They're not all, New York, Chicago's. There's a lot of little cities too. Even Greensburg, Kansas, the one that was devastated by the tornado a couple of years ago, they rebuilt green and went with green energy too, which is really interesting. So my best advice to you would be is to look for a city or a region of similar size and similar characteristics who are doing some really interesting things, and just call them up and say, hey, what are you doing? How are you doing it? What are the pros and the cons? Get some real world examples. And if you're looking for any help, you're welcome to email me through my website, just katharineHayhoe.com, and I'm happy to try to help you find them if you can't. But that's really the best thing to do, because so many people are doing things today that having that real world example is incredibly helpful. In terms of adaptation though, so that's for mitigation. In terms of adaptation, the number one thing to do, and I've done this with many cities, big and small, for a long time now, is to sit down and to say, how have we been impacted by any type of climate or weather issue in the last 2 or 3 decades? How have we been impacted? So for example, have we had some really serious summer heat that put a stress on our power grid? Or had some very negative impacts on our health? Was there a lot of admissions to the hospital? Have we had some really severe rainstorms that have led to some really unusual flooding? Have we had some droughts that have had a very negative impact on our local economy? Just talk about what's happened in your community, and you'll get a very clear picture with only a very short discussion of the ways that you're already being affected by weather and climate today. And 99 times out of 100, those are pretty much the ways that climate change is going to affect you in the future, except worse.
Thank you. I have a Jim Hansen question for you. Jim Hansen is preparing a report, Acceleration of Global Warming, about the greenhouse gas radiant forcing graph he circulated in late 2017. What is behind this increase in greenhouse gases?
So I would actually recommend reading chapter 4 of the science report that I refer to. I actually wrote that, and it is very specifically about greenhouse gas emissions, concentrations, and their radiative forcing in the atmosphere, and then how that connects to temperature. So it's kind of like a chain of dominoes. We produce these gases by burning fossil fuels and also through deforestation. And then these gases build up in the atmosphere, that's the concentration. And then in the atmosphere, they absorb the heat's energy and keep it from escaping to space. That's the radiative forcing. And then because they absorb the Earth's energy, they would otherwise escape to space, then they increase global temperature. So that's kind of the connection between emissions and global temperature. Now, here's the thing, and this is what Jim does so effectively. He pushes the envelope on the uncertainty, because as far back as we can go in the history of the Earth, we cannot find any time when this much carbon dioxide was going into the atmosphere this fast. We can find times when it was warmer, back in the dinosaur times, but we can never find a time when this much carbon was being shoved into the atmosphere as it is today. And so because of that, there's uncertainty associated with just how the planet's going to respond. We give our best guesses based on the latest physics of, if we produce this much, this is what's going to happen. But what we've seen happening over the last 20 years is that a lot of our predictions of if we do this, this is what's going to happen, have been a bit on the low side. And what Jim does in the scientific community is he's constantly pushing people to consider the risks of the higher side. And because of that, I think he does a very useful service to the community.
Thank you. Thank you. I have one last, it's actually not a question. It's a statement from one of our participants, and I think he represents everybody today, saying he feels honored to have experienced your presentation. And I too feel very honored, and I'm sure that everyone got a lot out of your presentation and will be able to watch it through the recording, which we'll send out to people tomorrow. So I would like to thank you so much for participating in this and for sharing your wisdom and your thoughts with us. And we hope as elders that we can make a difference. Mm-hmm. So thank you.
You can. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and good night. And this is our last webinar. Hopefully we will do some more next spring. And if you've enjoyed it, please fill out the, even if you haven't enjoyed them, please fill out the survey and let us know your thoughts and how we can improve upon them in the future. And also enjoy the recordings so you can go back and really dig into the slides that have been presented tonight. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a great night.